At 10 minutes past midnight on February 27, 1931, the great presses of the New York world thundered to life for the last time. And in the city room above them, grown men who had spent their lives chasing the truth stood at their desks and wept. The newspaper dying that night was not an ordinary newspaper. It had toppled corrupt senators, exposed swindlers, and built the immigrant who created it into one of the most feared men in America. And it was being killed, deliberately, by his own two sons. How does a father build the most powerful newspaper empire on earth? Write a will commanding his children to protect it forever, and guarantee with that very same document that they would tear each other apart instead. This is the story of the Pulitzers. The name is on the most prestigious award in journalism. It is carved into the school that trains reporters at Columbia. The founder, Joseph Pulitzer, came to America blind in one ambition, and left it blind in both eyes, commanding a media empire from a soundproof room while half a continent feared his frontage. A founder who ran his own sons like rival generals. A will that bound a family to a corpse it could not afford to feed. And 3 generations later, a grandson whose name, built on truth, would become the most sordid headline in America. Watch this not as a story about newspapers. Watch it as a study in what a father destroys when he cannot stop controlling the people he loves. Remember those silent presses. We will stand in that room again. Begin in 1864, on a recruiting dock, with a tall, gangly, half-blind teenager who has just crossed an ocean to fight in a war that is not his. He was 17. Born in Mako, Hungary, to a Magyar Jewish grain family that had money until his father died. And the money went with him. He had tried to enlist in 3 European armies, the Austrians, the French Foreign Legion, the British in India, and everyone had turned him away. His eyes were too weak, his chest was too thin. Then American recruiters came to Europe, hunting bodies for the Union Army, and the boy who could not get into any army on his own continent finally found one that would take anyone. His name was Joseph Pulitzer. He arrived in America owning nothing, speaking almost no English, with eyes that were already beginning to fail him. Picture him after the war. Penniless in St. Louis, sleeping rough, so foreign-looking and awkward that boys threw stones at him in the street. He took the jobs no one wanted, mule tender, waiter, dockhand. And in the public library at night, this stone-pelted immigrant taught himself English and law by lamplight, the way a starving man eats. What he had, the one thing no failing eye could take, was a ferocious, almost violent hunger to matter. He talked his way into a reporting job at a German-language paper, the Westliche Post. He was relentless, first to the scene, last to leave, incapable of letting a powerful man's lie stand unchallenged. Within a few years, the immigrant who'd been pelted with stones was buying newspapers of his own. He would later carve his creed into the record. A newspaper should have no friends. He meant it as a virtue, total independence, fear of no one. But hold that phrase, because it is the seed of everything that follows. No friends. It was how Joseph Pulitzer ran his papers. It became, tragically, how he ran his family. A man who trusted no one taught his own sons that trust itself was a weakness, and then act surprised when they could not trust each other. He built an empire on having no friends. He would die having proven it about his own children. The rise, when it came, was volcanic. In 1878, Pulitzer bought a bankrupt St. Louis paper at auction and fused it into the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, a paper built on a single radical idea, that a newspaper's job was to be the weapon of ordinary people against the powerful. He exposed tax dodgers, gambling rings, crooked politicians. Circulation exploded, but St. Louis was a rehearsal. In 1883, he bought the dying New York World from the financier Jay Gould for $346,000 and turned it, in just a few years, into the largest circulation newspaper in the entire United States. From near bankruptcy to the biggest paper in America in under a decade. How? By inventing more or less the modern popular newspaper. Crusades. The world hunted corruption like prey. And when France could not afford a pedestal for the Statue of Liberty, Pulitzer raised the money from his own readers, 120,000 of them, mostly in coins, and printed every single name, spectacle, bold headlines, illustrations, stunts. He sent reporter Nellie Bly around the world in 72 days to beat a fictional record, and the nation held its breath. The masses. He wrote for immigrants, for workers, for the people who had once thrown stones at him. They made him a multi-millionaire. And then a younger, richer man bought the rival New York Journal and began copying everything Pulitzer did, only louder, cheaper, and with less regard for the truth. His name was William Randolph Hearst. Their circulation war in the late 1890s gave the world a permanent phrase: yellow journalism. The two papers screamed each other into a frenzy that helped push the United States into war with Spain in 1898. It was the high noon of Joseph Pulitzer's power. He had a paper that could move the country to war. He had a fortune. He had a mansion, a yacht, and an empire of ink. He also, by now, had almost no eyesight at all. By his early 40s, a detached retina and ruined vision had left Pulitzer nearly blind, and afflicted with an agonizing sensitivity to sound, so severe that the smallest noise caused him physical pain. The most powerful editor in America could no longer read his own newspaper. So he built himself a prison, a life of soundproofed rooms and a custom-built yacht with a vault-quiet chamber, traveling the world in darkness and silence, running his empire through a small army of secretaries who read the world aloud to him and wrote down his commands. The empire roared. The man at its center sat in the dark. Consider what this blind man had become by the dawn of the new century. From a stone-pelted immigrant who couldn't enlist, to a publisher whose front page could make or break a president. Theodore Roosevelt feared him. Financiers dreaded the morning the world turned its attention to them. The Statue of Liberty stood on a pedestal his readers had paid for. He had, quite literally, helped reshape the skyline and the conscience of America. And here is the image to hold, the one verifiable, almost unbearable picture of him at his zenith. A man worth tens of millions, gliding across the Mediterranean on a private yacht named, with no apparent irony, Liberty, blind, wrapped in silence. Being read the headlines of the empire he could no longer see, dictating the fate of men he would never look at again. He had won everything the stone-throwing world had once denied him: power, wealth, permanence, revenge. And in those same years, at the height of it all, he turned his attention to the one project he believed would make the name Pulitzer immortal. Not a newspaper at all, but a plan. A great endowment to found a school of journalism at Columbia and to award annual prizes for the best of American writing and reporting. He was building his own monument, the Pulitzer Prize, a name meant to stand for truth forever. He was also, in the same study, drafting the will that would set his children at each other's throats. Because here is what the monument concealed. The blind man in the silent room was a tyrant to the people who loved him. Joseph Pulitzer raised his three sons, Ralph, Joseph II, and Herbert, not as heirs to be trusted, but as subordinates to be tested, criticized, and pitted against one another. He showered them with demands, and withheld his approval like a man rationing water in a drought. He judged them constantly and trusted none of them completely. The eldest, Ralph, he found too soft. The second, Joseph, he found too headstrong, and exiled him to St. Louis away from the prized New York paper. The youngest, Herbert, was still almost a boy. And yet to the family the father's verdict was already plain. He was building a hierarchy of favor, and his sons could all feel exactly where they stood. A man whose own creed was to have no friends, was raising three brothers to see each other not as allies, but as rivals for a dying king's regard. When Joseph Pulitzer died in 1911, he did not simply leave his sons a fortune. He left them a machine designed to keep ruling them from beyond the grave. A will that handed out the empire in deliberately unequal shares, locked the most valuable paper in a trust that forbade its sale forever, and all but guaranteed that the brother he favored least would inherit the future, while the brothers he favored most inherited a trap. To understand the feud that would last 100 years, we have to open the dead man's will. On the surface, the death of Joseph Pulitzer in October 1911 looked like the orderly succession of a great house. He died aboard his yacht in Charleston Harbor, in the silence he had spent 20 years cultivating, and the tributes he poured in from around the world. The empire passed to his sons exactly as planned. The papers kept printing, the fortune stayed intact, and within a few years, the founder's grandest gift to posterity came true. In 1917, the first Pulitzer Prizes were awarded, and Columbia's School of Journalism opened its doors. The name was already becoming a synonym for excellence, and this is exactly the moment these stories lie to you. The state funeral, the marble institutions, the sense that a great man has died but his order will hold. Everything looks like continuity, but the order would not hold. Because the founder had not actually trusted his sons to run anything, he had trusted a document. In his will, Joseph Pulitzer did something revealing. He left the controlling stock of his papers not to his sons outright, but largely in trust, and he distributed it unequally. The largest share, round 6/10, went to his youngest son Herbert, then still a young man with no real experience. The favoured elder son Ralph was installed at the head of the prized New York World, and his middle son Joseph II, the one he had exiled to St. Louis, was left with the Post-Dispatch, the paper everyone, including the family, regarded as the lesser prize. The founder thought he was protecting his empire by dividing it carefully. What he had actually drawn up was a battle plan, and he had assigned each of his sons a side. The detonator was a single clause. In his will, Joseph Pulitzer addressed the New York World, the paper he loved above all others, the engine of his power, with the language not of a businessman but of a man trying to cheat death. He commanded his sons to preserve and perpetuate it, and he expressly forbade its sale. The World was never, under any circumstances, to be sold. He was attempting to reach out of his own grave and hold his masterpiece in place forever. Think about the arrogance and the terror braided together in that clause. A man so afraid his children would betray his legacy that he tried to make betrayal illegal, to bind a living family, in perpetuity, to a thing he could no longer control because he was dead. For a while, it worked. Ralph and Herbert held the world. It remained a great and respected paper. The founder's hand, reaching from the grave, seemed to be steadying the ship. But the world had been built for was vanishing. The popular, crusading newspaper Pulitzer invented was now being outcompeted on every side, by tabloids that were cheaper and louder, by an evening market that was collapsing, by the simple fact that the city had too many papers and not enough readers. Through the 1920s, the World and its evening edition slowly began to bleed money. And here the founder's design curdled into cruelty. Because while the favoured sons in New York were chained to a magnificent, money-losing monument they were forbidden to sell, the exiled son in St. Louis was free. Joseph Pulitzer II, banished to the Post-Dispatch, had no glamorous burden and no impossible clause. He had only a paper to run and something to prove. And he ran it brilliantly, sober, principled, fiercely independent, exactly the kind of journalism his father had preached but rarely practiced in his Hearst-war years. In St. Louis, far from the family spotlight, the least favoured son was quietly building the only part of the empire that would survive the century. The founder had bet everything on New York and the sons he favoured. He had bet wrong. This is the cruel mathematics of Joseph Pulitzer's will. He gave his most loved sons his most loved paper, and in doing so he handcuffed them to a corpse. He gave his least loved son the freedom to actually build something. The favour was the curse. The exile was the gift. By the end of the 1920s, the World was losing serious money. The brothers who owned it were divided over what to do, and a clause written by a dead man stood between them and survival. Something had to break. And when it broke, it would break the family in half. The first casualty of Joseph Pulitzer's will was the brother caught in the middle of it. Ralph Pulitzer was the eldest, and from boyhood he had absorbed the worst of his father's treatment. Judged too gentle, too literary, not ruthless enough to run a great paper. And yet it was Ralph who was placed at the head of the world, handed the impossible job of keeping his dead father's masterpiece alive in a market that no longer wanted it, under a will that forbade him the one move, selling, that could have saved everyone. Picture his position. Every morning, a great newspaper that bore his family's name and his father's ghost. Every month the losses deepening. Every direction he turned, a clause in a dead man's hand telling him no. He was the editor-king of a kingdom quietly going bankrupt. Forbidden by his own father to do the one thing that would stop the bleeding. Ralph tried. He poured himself into the paper, reorganized it, fought for it. But he was a sensitive man strapped to an impossible machine, and the strain wore him down. His health failed. His first marriage failed. The grand inheritance his father had bestowed on him was, in practice, a slow-motion catastrophe he was forbidden to escape. And here is the wound passing from one generation to the next, invisible but unmistakable. Joseph Pulitzer had been raised by no one to trust no one, and he built an empire on it. Now his own son sat in the founder's chair, isolated, second-guessed by his brothers, bound by his father's dead hand, trusting no one and trusted by no one, repeating his father's loneliness without a fraction of his father's power. The founder had so feared betrayal that he wrote a will to prevent it. But the will itself was the betrayal. Of Ralph, handed a burden disguised as a crown. Of Herbert, the boy heir, who never asked for 6/10 of a sinking ship, of the bond between brothers, which the founder had spent their whole childhood teaching them not to have. What is the use of being the favored son, if favor means inheriting your father's prison? Not a death, but something colder. The moment we understand that the most loved sons were handed the most ruinous gift, and that the family's coming war was not an accident. It was written, clause by clause, by the man who claimed to love them most. The world was dying, Ralph was breaking, and the only way out, the only way to stop the losses and save what could be saved, was the one act their father had forbidden above all others: to sell, to break the will, to take the dead king's masterpiece and hand it to a stranger. The brothers were about to do exactly that, and it would split the family for the next 100 years. To the public, the Pulitzers remained spotless. In these very years, the Pulitzer Prizes were cementing themselves as the highest honor in American letters. The name on the world's masthead stood for courage, for the little man against the powerful, for journalism as a public trust. Every spring, the press celebrated the Pulitzers as the conscience of American journalism, the public name, integrity, idealism, the people's champion, the private reality. A famous family quietly arguing over how to dispose of their father's corpse empire before it dragged them all under. Behind the marble facade, the three brothers were no longer a family business. They were factions: Joseph II in St. Louis, running the one healthy paper and increasingly the real custodian of his father's ideals, and resentful, by every account, of how the New York brothers were handling the crown jewel. Ralph and Herbert in New York, bound together by ownership of a paper neither could save, and divided over what to do about it. The founder had wanted his name to mean truth, and it would, on a brass plaque at Columbia, on a certificate handed to the year's best reporters. But inside the family, the same name now meant something else entirely: a contested estate, a forbidden sale, and three sons who had been raised so carefully to compete that they had never once learned how to simply stand together. Because in early 1931, Ralph and Herbert Pulitzer walked into a New York courtroom and asked a judge to do the unthinkable. They asked him to break their own father's will, to let them sell the New York World, the paper he had forbidden them to sell, ever, under any circumstances. And the judge said yes. The case was called In re Pulitzer's estate, and what it asked the court to decide was, at its heart, a question about the rights of the dead. Joseph Pulitzer had commanded, in plain language, that the New York World never be sold. His sons now stood before a New York surrogate and argued that obeying their dead father would bankrupt them all. But the paper was losing money so fast that honoring the will would destroy not only the world but the family fortune meant to sustain his prizes and his school. Sit with the irony, because it is enormous. Joseph Pulitzer spent his life as a journalist exposing the powerful, championing the public, insisting that institutions serve people and not the other way around. And here were his own children, in court, arguing that his most sacred written wish should be overturned because an institution could no longer be made to pay. The founder's idealism, on trial, defeated by the founder's own arithmetic. The brothers' lawyers made the cold case: a trust cannot be ordered to operate at a ruinous perpetual loss. The will's command to keep the world alive forever was, they argued, impossible to obey without destroying the very estate the will was meant to protect. The dead hand had asked for something the living could not deliver. On February 27, 1931, the court agreed. The surrogate authorized the sale. The clause that Joseph Pulitzer had written to make betrayal illegal was struck down, and the way was clear to sell the paper he had loved most in the World. The buyer was Roy Howard of the Scripps Howard chain. The price for the World, the Evening World, and the Sunday edition, the empire that had once been the circulation newspaper in America, was roughly $5 million. And Howard did not want the paper to keep publishing. He wanted its circulation, its assets, its name to fold into his own evening paper. He bought the World in order to end it. The thing Joseph Pulitzer had forbidden above all else had been done, and done by his own favored sons. Picture the two halves of the family in that moment. In New York, Ralph and Herbert, the favored sons, signing away their father's masterpiece to a man who would extinguish it. In St. Louis, Joseph II, the exiled, least favored son, watching from a distance, having begged them, by some accounts, not to let the world die, and powerless to stop it. The sons the father trusted were the ones who sold him out. The son he didn't trust was the one trying to keep faith. This was the fracture. Not a shouting match, not a single dramatic betrayal. Something deeper. From this point forward, the family was permanently divided into the branch that sold the world and the branch that kept the faith in St. Louis. The wound the founder had cut in their childhood. Favorite against exile, brother against brother, now had a date, a courtroom, and a price tag, and it would never fully heal. The descendants of Joseph II in St. Louis would carry the Post-Dispatch and the family's journalistic conscience. For decades, the New York branch would carry the money, the social glamour, and in time the scandals. One will, two families, 100 years of distance. But first, the dead man's masterpiece had to actually die. And the night it did, 3,000 people learned what the family feud had cost them. So who betrayed whom? The easy answer is that Ralph and Herbert betrayed their father, broke his will, sold his paper, defied his dying command. And in the literal sense, they did. But look harder, because the real betrayal runs the other way, and it runs backward in time. Joseph Pulitzer betrayed his sons first. He raised them to compete instead of to trust. He handed the favored ones a paper he had rigged to fail, and forbidden them to save. He wrote a will that put his own vanity, his terror of being forgotten, ahead of his children's ability to survive. He tried to rule them from the grave, and in doing so, he forced them into the very act of disloyalty he most feared. The brothers did not break faith with a loving father. They broke free from a controlling one. And the price of that freedom was the destruction of the thing he loved most, and a permanent split with the brother who stayed loyal. That is the cruelty of the Pulitzer inheritance. The founder built a trap so perfect that loyalty and survival became opposites. To save the family, the sons had to betray the father. To honor the father, they would have had to destroy the family. There was no clean choice. He had made sure of that, in writing, before he died. Now we return to the room where this story began. The night of February 27th, 1931. The newsroom of the New York World. The sale is signed. The final edition is set. The presses are about to run for the last time. And the men in that city room, reporters, editors, copy boys, some of whom had given their entire working lives to this paper, understood exactly what was happening. They were not losing an argument among the rich. They were losing their livelihoods in the depths of the Great Depression, when there were no other jobs to be had. Roughly, 3,000 people worked for the Pulitzer papers being sold. Most of the world's staff would not be kept. The last edition carried its own farewell. Grown men wept openly at their desks. The reporters of the most famous newspaper in America had to write the obituary of the newspaper that fed them, and then go home and tell their families. This is the cost the family feud always hides behind its marble and its prizes. When a dynasty fractures, it is rarely the dynasty that pays first. It is the 3,000 ordinary people whose names were never in the will, who simply worked there, and who lost everything because a dead man and his sons could not be reconciled. The presses thundered. The last papers rolled out wet into the February night, and then, just after midnight, the great machines of the New York World fell silent. 48 years after a half-blind immigrant bought a dying paper and made it the loudest voice in America, the world went quiet, killed by the family that bore its founder's name. In the days after, the scale of what had happened came clear. The New York World, the paper that had funded the Statue of Liberty's pedestal, sent Nellie Bly around the globe, broken corrupt senators, and built an immigrant into a kingmaker, was gone. Not declining, not sold to a careful steward. Gone, its name swallowed into the New York World Telegram, its identity erased. 3,000 jobs, a 48-year-old institution, the single greatest engine of Joseph Pulitzer's power and reputation. All extinguished, and for what the family received, a sum that would barely register against the wealth the world had once generated. The crown jewel was sold for the price of stopping the bleeding. And here is the devastation beneath the devastation. The founder had built two monuments to outlive him. The first was the world, the living, breathing daily proof of his genius. The second was the Pulitzer Prize and the Columbia School, the marble, the endowment, the name in gold. His children destroyed the living monument to preserve the dead one. Think about what that means. The Pulitzer Prize survives to this day precisely because the family chose the endowment over the enterprise, the trust fund over the newspaper, the name over the thing the name was earned doing. Every spring, when the Pulitzer Prizes are announced as the highest honor in journalism, they are funded, in part, by the decision to kill the greatest piece of journalism Joseph Pulitzer ever built. The monument lives because the masterpiece died. But there was one survivor, and it was the one no one had bet on. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the lesser prize, the paper handed to the exiled, least favored son, Joseph Pulitzer II, while the favored New York branch was selling and dismantling the crown jewel. Joseph II in St. Louis was doing the quiet, unglamorous work his father had preached and never fully lived, building a newspaper of genuine independence and integrity, free of the Hearst-style sensationalism that had made the world famous and compromised. Under Joseph II and his descendants, the Post-Dispatch became, for decades, one of the most respected papers in America, a repeated winner of the very prizes that bore the family name. The son the father trusted least became the keeper of everything the father claimed to believe in. Read that again, because it is the whole tragedy in one line. Joseph Pulitzer spent his life judging his children, ranking them, favoring and exiling them. And he ranked them exactly wrong. He bet his legacy on the sons he loved and the paper he loved, and both failed him. He dismissed the son he exiled and the paper he scorned, and they carried his name with honor into the next century. What does it say about a father, that the child he valued least turned out to be the only one who truly inherited his soul? The favored sons got the fortune and the glamour. The New York branch would, in time, drift towards society pages and scandal. The exiled son got nothing but a lesser paper, and something his brothers were never given the chance to develop. A clear conscience, and a thing of his own to be proud of. The founder's judgment, which he trusted above all things, was the one asset in the entire estate that proved worthless, and it returns us, finally, to the creed he carved into the record at the very beginning, the 4 words that explain the whole 100-year wreck. At the start, I told you Joseph Pulitzer left behind a creed, that a newspaper should have no friends, and that he meant it as a virtue. It is time to weigh what it really cost. As a principle of journalism, it was magnificent. A paper beholden to no one, no advertiser, no party, no powerful friend is free to tell the truth. It is the spine of everything good the Pulitzer name still stands for. But Joseph Pulitzer did not keep the creed inside the newsroom. He lived it. A man who believed attachment was a liability, who trusted no one completely, who ran his own household like an editor riding a reporter, never satisfied, always testing, withholding approval as a tool of control. He raised 3 sons to have no friends in one another. He taught them that the way to earn a Pulitzer's regard was to outcompete a brother, never to stand beside one. That was the seed. That was the darkest secret of the dynasty. Not a crime, not a scandal, but a philosophy. A founder who took the one rule that made his journalism great and applied it, fatally, to the people who shared his blood. A newspaper with no friends is independent. A family with no friends is just a collection of rivals waiting for the patriarch to die. And when he did die, that is precisely what they proved to be. The will didn't create the feud. The will only revealed it. The feud had been planted in 3 little boys' childhoods, decades earlier, by a father who could not love without controlling, and could not control without dividing. He got his wish, in the end. The Pulitzers had no friends. Not even each other. The presses were silent. The world was dead. The family was split into branches that would barely speak for generations. And the name, that golden, honored name, was about to be carried by a grandson into a courtroom of a very different kind. For a time, it seemed the exiled son's branch might redeem the whole family. Joseph Pulitzer sued ran the St. Louis Post-Dispatch until his death in 1955, and he ran it the way his father had only preached. Independent, principled, unafraid. He kept the paper's famous platform on its masthead, a creed the founder had written, demanding that journalism always fight for progress and reform, and never tolerate injustice or corruption. And then, unlike the founder, he actually lived by it. The New York branch had taken the glamour and the fortune, and sold the crown jewel. The St. Louis branch took the lesser paper and won honor with it. Pulitzer prizes earned, not just awarded, corruption exposed, a reputation as one of the finest newspapers in the country. The son ranked last delivered the legacy the father wanted most. His son, Joseph Pulitzer III, carried it further still, running the Post-Dispatch, the family's broadcasting interests, with the same sober integrity, through the second half of the century. And for a moment, watching the St. Louis branch, you might think the curse had been broken, that one son simply refused the poison and raised his own children clean. It is a comforting thought. But a dynasty is not one branch, it is all of them. And while the St. Louis Pulitzers were quietly honoring the name, another branch of the family, descended through the founder's most favored line, the one that had held the glamour and the money, was drifting somewhere the founder never imagined his name could go. Toward the front page, as the scandal. The founder built his name on a single proposition, that the press existed to expose the powerful and protect the public. The name Pulitzer meant the watchman, the one who held the light. 3 generations later, in the branch that had inherited the wealth without the work, the name came to mean something almost perfectly opposite. The kind of moneyed, glittering, Palm Beach existence that the world of the 1880s would have investigated, not joined. This is the slow violence of the founder's doctrine, playing out across a century. He taught his bloodline to compete for status and to treat relationships as instruments. Strip away the newspapers, which the New York branch no longer had, and what is left of that inheritance? The hunger for status, with nothing meaningful left to point it at. A family taught to win, with nothing honorable left to win. The favored line had the founder's appetite and none of his purpose. The exiled line had his purpose and none of his fame. The will of 1911 had split the soul of the family right down the middle, and each half had been incomplete ever since. And into that incomplete, glamorous, purposeless half was born grandson, who carried one of the most honored names in American journalism, and who would, in 1982, drag it through a courtroom so lurid that the watchman's name became, for a season, the loudest scandal in the country. His grandfather had built the machine that destroys the reputations of the powerful. His grandson was about to feed that machine his own. His name was Herbert Pulitzer Jr., known to everyone as Peter, a grandson of the founder, an heir to the family's wealth and its golden name, living the life of a wealthy Palm Beach citrus and real estate man. In 1982, Peter Pulitzer and his wife Roxanne divorced. And it was not a quiet divorce. It became one of the most sensational trials in America that year. A Palm Beach spectacle of wealth, infidelity, drugs, and allegations so lurid the tabloids could hardly keep up. The proceedings spilled across the front pages of the very kind of newspapers the founder had pioneered. The name Pulitzer, the name on journalism's highest honor, was now the headline, the scandal, the punchline. Consider the symmetry, because it is almost unbearable. Joseph Pulitzer invented the popular newspaper that thrived on exactly this. Money, sex, scandal, the private lives of the powerful turned into public spectacle for the masses. He built the machine, and 4 generations later, the machine he built turned and devoured his own grandson, splashing the Pulitzer name across the nation in precisely the register the founder had perfected. The watchman's family had become the thing the watchman watched. And here is what makes it a tragedy rather than a punchline. Peter Pulitzer did not fall because he was uniquely wicked. He fell because of what his branch of the family had become, a line taught across a century to value status and money and winning, and stripped of the one thing that had ever given the Pulitzer name meaning, a purpose larger than itself. The St. Louis branch had the purpose. The New York branch had only the appetite. And appetite without purpose, given enough money and enough generations, almost always ends in a courtroom or a tabloid. By the early 2000s, the last great institutional piece of the empire would go too. In 2005, the company that grew from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch was sold, the founder's surviving paper passing, at last, out of family hands. The newspapers were gone. The fortune had scattered. What remained of Joseph Pulitzer was a prize, a school, and a name that the public associated with excellence and the family associated with a 100-year fault line. 2 branches. One had the honor and lost the paper. One had the money and lost the name to scandal. And neither of them in the end had each other. That was the founder's true estate. Lay the whole century out, end to end, and look at what one man's need for control actually produced. Joseph Pulitzer, the founder, died in 1911. The most powerful publisher in America, blind, sealed in silence, having built 2 monuments and rigged a will to rule his children from the grave. Ralph, the eldest, the favored editor of the world, worn down by an inheritance that was secretly a trap, his health and first marriage broken by the impossible job his father gave him, dead in 1939. The New York World itself, 48 years of journalism, 3,000 livelihoods, killed in 1931 by the founder's own son. The masterpiece sacrificed to preserve the monument. Joseph II, the exiled son, who won the honor his father craved and never received the love his father should have given, custodian of a paper his father had scorned. And the name itself, carried by a grandson into a 1982 scandal that made Pulitzer a tabloid headline, then sold out of the family entirely by 2005. One cause sits beneath all of it. Not money, not the Depression, not changing markets, though all of those played their part. The cause was a father who could not love his children without ranking them, could not guide them without dividing them, and could not trust his legacy to living hands, so he tried to chain it to a dead one. Every fracture, in 100 years of Pulitzers, traces back to that single flaw, written into a will in 1911. This is the bitter truth the Pulitzer story exists to deliver. We tell ourselves that if we build something great enough, a fortune, an institution, a name that outlives us, our children will be safe inside it. Joseph Pulitzer built one of the greatest names in American history. He endowed a prize that still crowns the best of us every year. And he could not build the one thing that would have actually protected his family, the ability of his sons to trust and stand beside one another. What is the use of a name that the whole world honors if the people who carry it cannot bear to be in the same room? The founder feared being forgotten, so he is remembered, gloriously, every spring, in gold letters. And the family that bore his name spent 100 years proving that he had remembered everything except how to be a father. Be careful with the lesson, because it would be easy to take the wrong one. The lesson is not, ambition is poison. Joseph Pulitzer's ambition lifted a stone-pelted immigrant into the rooms where the nation's conscience was written. It funded a pedestal for liberty. It created a prize that has protected and honored truth-telling for over a century. Ambition built all of that, and the world is better for it. The villain was never the ambition. The villain was the control, the founder's inability to extend to his own children the one thing he extended to his readers: trust. He gave the public the truth and gave his sons a hierarchy. He gave strangers his protection and gave his heirs a competition. He ran his family on the one principle that makes great journalism and ruins great families: have no friends. And this is where the dead Pulitzers stop being a story and start being a mirror. Because the trade Joseph Pulitzer made is one every ambitious person is tempted to make. The belief that if you just build a big enough thing, a company, a fortune, a legacy, it will stand in for the warmth and the trust you were too busy, or too guarded, or too afraid to give the people closest to you. It will not. The Pulitzers are the proof. They had the prize, the school, the fortune, the most honored name in their field, and it could not buy back a single brother, or heal a single branch, or keep two halves of one family speaking across 100-year silence. The thing you build is not the thing that protects your children. You are. And there is no will, however carefully written, that can do that job after you are gone. There is a boy, somewhere in your memory of this story, standing on a recruiting dock in 1864, half-blind, foreign, pelted with stones, wanting so badly to matter that he would cross an ocean and fight a stranger's war for the chance. He got everything he wanted. He mattered more than almost any immigrant in American history. His name became a word for excellence. His prize still crowns the best of us every single year. And the family that carried that name spent the century after his death divided into halves that could barely speak. One keeping the honor, one keeping the money, neither keeping each other. He built a monument that the world still honors. He could not build a family that could survive him. The Pulitzers are the dynasty whose feud lasted 100 years. Now you know it was not an accident of money or markets. It was written, in a will, by a father who loved his legacy more than he ever learned to love his sons. Build your name if you must, but build your family first.